Sometimes life surprises you in the quietest places. I never thought that an ordinary Saturday afternoon in my garage would turn into something that would make me question everything I thought I understood about trust, companionship, and the unexpected ways people can see through you. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Are you somewhere warm and sunny, or tucked away in a place where autumn has already started to show its colors? Tell me in the comments. I always love hearing your stories too. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and tap that little thumbs up. It helps more than you know, and I promise you won't want to miss what happens next. That day, the house was unusually quiet. My husband, Greg, had gone out to play golf with a few friends, leaving me alone with the hum of the washing machine and the smell of motor oil that always lingered near the garage. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I often looked forward to these small stretches of silence. The garage had become my little refuge, where I kept old family boxes, painted small furniture projects, and occasionally just sat with a cup of coffee when the house felt too big. I was rearranging a few boxes when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. They weren't rushed, just steady, almost hesitant. The side door creaked open, letting in a slice of sunlight that fell right across the dusty floor. I turned, half expecting Greg, but it wasn't him. It was Mark, his closest friend. Mark had known Greg since college. They worked in the same company for years before Mark retired early. He was about my age, maybe a year or two older, with graying hair that somehow made him look more distinguished rather than older. He had that calm presence some men carry, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but quietly draws it. "Hey," he said with a soft chuckle. "Didn't mean to startle you. Greg told me to pick up the old golf bag he said you still had here." I smiled, brushing a bit of dust off my hands. "Oh, right. It's in the corner somewhere. He mentioned it, but I forgot you'd be stopping by today." He stepped inside, his boots echoing lightly on the concrete. For a moment, I noticed how tall he seemed in the dim light of the garage. There was something oddly comforting about his presence, steady and sure, like an old photograph you hadn't looked at in years but instantly recognized. As he walked past me, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the air, woodsy, clean, and warm. He glanced around. "You really keep this place neat. I can barely find anything in my own garage." I laughed softly. "It's my therapy spot. Everything here has a place, except maybe me." He looked at me, then really looked, and I felt a quiet understanding pass between us. Not romantic, not improper, just a moment of being seen. It's strange how sometimes you don't realize how invisible you've been feeling until someone's gaze lingers just long enough to remind you that you still exist beyond your routines. We found the golf bag behind a few old boxes. When he bent down to grab it, I noticed a few streaks of gray at the back of his neck, the kind that blend effortlessly into sun-weathered skin. He struggled a bit with the strap, and I stepped forward to help. Our hands brushed, lightly, accidentally. It was such a small thing, a fleeting, meaningless touch, but it felt charged somehow, like static before a storm. He smiled, a little awkwardly, and said, "You still have that knack for jumping in to help." I smiled back, but I felt my heart beat a little faster. Not because of him exactly, but because I hadn't felt noticed like that in a long time. Greg was a good man, steady, loyal, but over the years, our conversations had thinned out like an old shirt stretched too many times. We existed together, comfortably, but quietly. Mark slung the golf bag over his shoulder and looked around again. "You've got some nice projects here," he said, nodding toward a small table I was sanding. "Yeah," I said, suddenly aware of how messy my hair probably looked and how the old t-shirt I wore wasn't doing me any favors. "I've been trying to bring that table back to life. It was my mother's. She used to keep her sewing kit on it." He walked over, running a finger lightly over the grain. "It's beautiful wood. worth saving. For a moment, his voice softened in a way that made my chest tighten. He wasn't talking about the table anymore. Not really. Silence filled the space, thick and tender. Outside, I could hear the faint hum of a neighbor's lawnmower, the world still spinning as if nothing unusual was happening. But something in that stillness felt different, like a door had opened, not in the room, but somewhere deep inside me. Mark broke the silence first. "You know, I've always admired how you notice the small things," he said quietly. "Even back when we'd all hang out, you'd remember details no one else did. You make people feel like they matter." The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked away, pretending to adjust the sandpaper, but my throat tightened. "That's kind of you to say," I murmured. "I don't know if that's true anymore." He smiled faintly, setting the golf bag down again. "It is. Maybe you just forgot for a while." It was such a simple statement, yet it felt like a truth I hadn't been brave enough to admit. For years, I'd been fading into the background of my own life, running errands, managing schedules, keeping things in order. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen for something other than what I did. We talked a while longer, about old memories, about the town, about how fast the years had gone. His laughter filled the garage in a way that made the shadows seem less heavy. Eventually, he picked up the golf bag again, ready to leave. "Tell Greg I got it," he said, pausing at the door. Then he turned back with a small, thoughtful smile. "You know, you should come by one of these weekends when we're out there. It'd be good for you to get out of the house a bit." I nodded, trying to sound casual. "Maybe I will." He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just said, "Take care, okay." And then he was gone. I stood there for a while after the door closed, staring at the empty space where he'd been. The garage felt different somehow, not emptier, but awake, like something inside me had shifted. I couldn't explain it, and maybe I didn't want to. All I knew was that for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. When Greg got home later that evening, I said nothing about Mark's visit. I made dinner. We talked about his game, and everything went on as usual. But that night, when I walked past the garage again, I paused by the table I'd been sanding. I touched the smooth surface, still rough in places, still unfinished, and smiled softly. Some things, I realized, don't need to be rushed. They just need to be noticed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Mark standing in the soft light of the garage came back, the way he looked at me when he said I'd forgotten myself. It wasn't romantic exactly, but it struck something deep, something that had been quiet for too long. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I went about my day. Coffee, laundry, the usual routine, but everything felt slightly tilted. Even the sunlight seemed to linger differently across the kitchen counter. It's funny how one simple conversation can echo in your mind louder than 1,000 words said over years of routine. A few days later, I ran into him again, completely by chance. Or maybe not. I had gone to the local hardware store to pick up some varnish for the table. I was halfway down the aisle, squinting at the tiny print on the cans, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Still fixing up that table, huh?" I turned, and there he was again. Mark, dressed casually in a navy jacket, sleeves slightly rolled, with that same calm smile that seemed to slow down the air around him. I laughed softly. "You have a good memory." He shrugged. "You don't forget much about people who notice things. That table must be lucky. It's getting all your attention." I shook my head, smiling. "I'm just trying to make it look like it once did. It's harder than I thought." He stepped closer, glancing at the cans in my hands. "You'll need a softer brush if you don't want streaks. Here, this one works better." He reached for a small box from the shelf and handed it to me. His fingers brushed against mine, again, just for a second, and I felt that familiar jolt. It wasn't about attraction, not in the usual sense. It was something deeper. Recognition, maybe. We walked to the counter together, talking about nothing and everything. How the town had changed, how people seemed busier but less connected. When we stepped outside, the air was cool, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. "Want to grab a coffee?" he asked, his tone easy, unassuming. For a moment I hesitated. I thought about Greg, about how he'd probably think nothing of it. Mark was his friend after all. And yet, a small voice in my mind whispered that this felt like more than just coffee. Still, I nodded. Sure. There's that cafe across the street. The cafe was quiet, filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the smell of roasted beans. We found a small table by the window. Mark stirred his coffee slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "You know," he said, "Greg used to talk about how organized you are, how you keep everything together. He'd always say you're the glue that keeps the house running." I smiled faintly. I suppose that's true. But glue doesn't get noticed much, does it? He looked up at me, his expression soft but serious. Maybe not, but it holds everything that matters. I didn't know what to say. His words were kind, but they also reminded me of how invisible that role had begun to feel. It wasn't resentment I felt, it was weariness, the kind that settles in quietly over years. We talked for nearly an hour. He told me about his late wife, how she used to plant roses every spring, even though she was allergic to them. She said beauty was worth the sneezing, he said with a small laugh. I could hear the tenderness in his voice, the way love lingers long after it's gone. When I spoke, I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone in years. How I'd stopped painting, how I sometimes walked through the house at night, just to feel like I was still moving through life. It was strange how easy it was to talk to him. There was no judgment, no advice, just presence. When we finally stood to leave, the rain had started, soft and steady. He offered to walk me to my car, holding his jacket over us as we crossed the street. The rain tapped gently against the fabric, close enough that I could hear his breathing, steady and warm beside me. At my car, I turned to thank him. "You didn't have to do that," I said. He smiled. I wanted to. For a brief second, neither of us moved. The rain made tiny rivers on the windshield, blurring the world around us. He looked at me, really looked, and for that suspended moment, it felt like time had forgotten to keep moving. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Take care, all right? And don't forget the softer brush." I laughed quietly, grateful for the way he broke the moment just as it started to feel too fragile. "I won't." As I drove home, the rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the roof of the car. I caught myself smiling for no reason at all. But underneath that smile was a flicker of guilt, small but real. I hadn't done anything wrong, but part of me knew that some connections, even innocent ones, could shift the ground beneath your feet. That evening I sat in the garage again, looking at my mother's table. I opened the new varnish, dipped the soft brush, and began to paint slow, even strokes. The scent of the wood and varnish filled the air. And as I worked, I thought about the way Mark had spoken, gentle, sincere, and full of quiet understanding. I thought about how strange it was that sometimes the person who helps you remember who you are isn't the one who's been there all along, but someone who simply walks in, unexpected, uninvited, and sees you. When I finally finished for the night, I stepped back and looked at the table. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its own imperfect way. Just like life, I thought. Just like people. I turned off the light, closing the garage door behind me. But even as I did, I knew something had changed again. Something small, maybe invisible to anyone else, but unmistakable to me. And deep down, I also knew this wasn't the last time I'd see him. A few days passed before I saw him again, but he wasn't far from my thoughts. Every time I walked into the garage, the faint smell of varnish seemed to carry echoes of our conversation. That table, once just an old piece of furniture, had started to feel like a reflection of me, something once overlooked, slowly being restored. Greg had been busy that week, traveling for work, leaving early and coming home late. Our conversations had grown shorter, our laughter quieter. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the slow erosion that time sometimes brings. We built a life together, steady and reliable, but somewhere in that steadiness, we'd stopped looking at each other the way we used to. On Friday afternoon, I was in the garage again, wiping off the last coat of polish from the table when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I'd assumed it was Greg coming home early, but when I glanced through the window, it was Mark's truck. My heart skipped, not from excitement exactly, but from that mix of surprise and curiosity that I couldn't quite name. He stepped out, holding a small paper bag in his hand and smiling. "I come bearing peace offerings," he said, lifting the bag slightly. I laughed. "What's this?" "Your favorite. Cinnamon rolls from Betty's bakery. I remembered you mentioned them at the cafe." I felt a warmth rise in my chest. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said simply. "You were on my way, and I thought maybe you could use a small break from all this sanding." I motioned him inside, and we sat at the small workbench near the table. He handed me one of the rolls, still warm, frosting just beginning to melt. The sweetness filled the air, blending with the scent of wood and varnish. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed to a gentle hum. He looked around the garage, nodding approvingly. "You finished it. It's beautiful." "Almost," I said. "There are still small imperfections." "That's what makes it real," he replied. "Things that have lived a life shouldn't look perfect." We sat quietly for a moment, eating and listening to the soft rustle of wind outside. There was something peaceful about it, unspoken but heavy with meaning. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I've been thinking about you." I froze slightly, unsure how to respond. His tone wasn't flirtatious. It was thoughtful, careful. "About me?" He nodded. "About what you said the other day. How you walk through the house at night just to feel like you're moving. I get that. I've done the same in my own way." I felt something tighten in my chest. It's strange, isn't it? How silence can feel heavier than noise. He looked at me, eyes kind but searching. "It's not strange. It just means you still feel. That's rare these days." For a long moment, I couldn't look away. His words touched something in me that I tried to ignore, the loneliness that had quietly settled into the corners of my life. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the door slightly. I looked down at my hands, still dusty from the polish. "Greg's been away a lot lately," I said softly, surprising myself. "Work, trips. I guess we've just gotten used to not really being in the same room." Mark nodded slowly. "It happens. Life gets busy. People stop seeing each other even when they're in the same place." There was no judgment in his voice, just understanding. It made it easier to keep talking. I used to think that was just part of getting older, settling into quiet. But lately, I wonder if maybe it's something we let happen without realizing it. He studied me for a moment, his gaze gentle. "Maybe you're not settling. Maybe you're waking up." The air felt heavier then, as if the room itself was listening. He reached across the table and brushed a speck of dust from my wrist. His hand lingered for just a heartbeat, long enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin, the weight of everything unspoken between us. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't simple either. That touch carried 1,000 unsaid things. Loneliness, understanding, longing for something we couldn't quite name. I pulled my hand back slowly, not out of discomfort, but out of fear that if I didn't, I'd lose my balance in that moment. I tried to steady my breath. "You always say things that make me think too much," I said quietly, trying to smile. He gave a soft chuckle. And you always listen like it matters. We both laughed, the tension dissolving just a little, but the silence that followed was full of electricity. Gentle, not dangerous, but deeply alive. He stood then, brushing crumbs from his jeans. I should let you get back to work before Greg wonders where all the cinnamon rolls went. I smiled. He won't. He barely touches sweets these days. Mark paused, his hand on the doorknob. Then all the more reason you deserve one. He glanced at me one last time, his eyes worn but serious. You remind me that life isn't over just because it's quieter now. And with that, he was gone again, just like the first time. I sat there for a long while after he left, my fingers tracing the edge of the table. His words echoed in my mind, soft but persistent. Maybe you're waking up. That night, Greg came home late again, talking about meetings and travel plans. I smiled, nodded, and listened, but my mind was elsewhere, in the garage, with the faint scent of varnish and cinnamon still lingering in the air. Later, when the house was silent, I slipped into the garage once more. The light from the single bulb cast a warm glow over the table, and I ran my hand across its surface. Smooth, finished, alive. Something inside me stirred again, an ache, but also a quiet strength. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was that had been sleeping inside me, it wasn't asleep anymore. The morning after that visit felt different, even though everything looked the same. The table gleamed softly under the garage light, the scent of cinnamon still faint in the air. But the calmness I'd felt before had turned into something more complicated, a quiet awareness that nothing inside me was quite where it used to be. I tried to distract myself that day, folding laundry, tidying the kitchen, running errands that didn't really need doing. But my thoughts kept circling back to him, to the way his eyes softened when he listened, to how he never rushed his words, to how he made silence feel safe instead of empty. Greg came home that evening, tired but cheerful. He talked about his day while scrolling through his phone, half listening to himself. I smiled, nodded, and placed dinner on the table. It was all routine, comfortable, predictable. Yet in that normalcy, I felt an ache I couldn't quite hide anymore. After dinner, he mentioned something casually. Oh, by the way, I think Mark might stop by this weekend. He said he wanted to return something I left in his truck. I froze, my spoon hovering mid-air. Oh, really? Yeah, Greg said, oblivious. He's been on his own a lot since his wife passed. I think it's good that we keep him around, you know? He needs company. I nodded, forcing a smile. Yes, he does. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts weren't racing, exactly. They were whispering. About friendship, about boundaries, about how sometimes the most meaningful moments in life come disguised as ordinary ones. I wasn't falling for him, not in the way people assume, but something deeper had begun, a rediscovery of feeling of attention, of being seen. Saturday arrived, warm and golden. Greg left early for errands, and around noon, Mark's truck pulled up just as he said it would. I met him at the door, trying to steady the flutter in my chest. He smiled when he saw me. Greg around. He stepped out, I said, but he'll be back soon. He nodded, stepping inside. I'll just drop this off, then. He handed me a small box, something Greg must have left behind weeks ago. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavier than before, weighted with the things we hadn't said. I gestured toward the kitchen. You can stay for coffee if you'd like. He shouldn't be long. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. All right, 1 cup. We sat across from each other at the table, the same distance we'd shared in the cafe weeks ago. But it felt different now, quieter, more fragile. Mark, I said softly, breaking the silence, the other day, when you said maybe I'm waking up. I've been thinking about that. He looked at me carefully. Hand? I think you're right. But waking up can be confusing. It's not about what's missing from my marriage. It's more about realizing how much of myself I stopped seeing. He nodded slowly. I understand. It's easy to forget who you are when you've spent years taking care of everything and everyone else. I didn't realize how much I'd faded, I said, until someone reminded me I was still here. He met my gaze, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes that's all we can do for each other, remind one another that we're still alive. For a long moment, we sat in silence. There was no need for more words. Everything that needed to be said had already been understood. Then, outside, I heard the faint sound of Greg's car pulling into the driveway. We both stood instinctively. I felt the air shift, reality rushing back in. Mark smiled gently, the kind of smile that carries both warmth and distance. I should go, he said quietly. I nodded. Thank you for everything. For reminding me. He paused at the door, turning back just once. Don't let yourself fade again, okay? Life's too short for that. And then he was gone. When Greg walked in moments later, everything slipped back into place as if nothing had changed. We unpacked groceries, talked about dinner plans, and went on with our day. But inside, I knew something had shifted permanently, something quiet but unshakable. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I went out to the garage one last time. The table gleamed softly in the fading light. I ran my hand across its surface, tracing the smooth wood grain. It was finished now, polished, whole, alive again. And so was I. I realized that what happened between Mark and me wasn't a story about temptation or betrayal. It was about awakening, about remembering that being alive means allowing yourself to feel, even when it's messy, even when it surprises you. Greg joined me a few minutes later, leaning against the doorway. That table turned out really nice, he said, smiling. You did a great job. Thanks, I said quietly. It just needed a little attention. He nodded, stepping closer. I've been thinking, maybe we should take a trip soon. Just the two of us. It's been too long since we've done something for ourselves. I looked up at him, caught off guard, but smiling. I'd like that. As he turned off the light and wrapped an arm around me, I glanced once more at the table, the same one that had started this quiet unraveling inside me. Sometimes, life wakes you up in the most unexpected places, in the smell of varnish, in an unexpected conversation, in a quiet touch that reminds you of your own pulse. I didn't know what the future would bring, but that night, for the first time in years, I felt ready to live it fully again.